Welcome, everybody, back to the Nick Halaris Show. Our guest this week is my good friend, Cristian Ahumada, the executive director of Holos Communities. Cristian, it's great to have you on the show. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for having me, Nick.
Yeah, we've been planning this for quite some time, so I'm glad that we finally got a chance to sit down and do this face-to-face. I think a good place to start is just tell us all a little bit about Holos Communities and what you're focused on there.
Sure. So until not too long ago, the artist previously known as Clifford Beers Housing rebranded itself. And what we did was we reflected on our work on the decade prior. And we said we're building housing for the most vulnerable, we're providing services, but we feel like we're not really doing everything we can do. And we're definitely not doing it in a holistic manner. But innately, we, Holos staff, are nerds. We're folks that are deeply care about this, and we're knee deep in things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how to infuse that into our work. And so we reflected during the pandemic, and we said, how can we find the intersectionality between housing, sustainability, and equity? And that sort of search is what prompted that rebrand in a manner that's more comprehensive, hence holos, meaning holistic in Greek.
Nice. I always love a good Greek reference. Almost every company that I've ever started or anything has that reference. So Clifford Beers, the predecessor to Holos, is an organization that has like a background in like mental health, right? Like that was kind of the original genesis. It goes back quite some time, right?
Yes, it goes back about 100 years.
Okay.
So Clifford Beers, the man, was an individual that was born to a very affluent family back east. And this individual had 4 other siblings. All of them battled mental illness, including Clifford Beers, the man. All of them died in mental institutions. And then Clifford Beers managed to survive that period of time, like I said, in mental institutions, and went on to actually write a book called The Mind That Found Itself. And that book is what founded mental health reform as we know it today. Mental Health America then was created. And from there, the previous Clifford Beers Housing, was the development arm back in 2005 until we became independent of Mental Health America in 2013 when I came on board.
Okay. And Mental Health America is still sort of a going concern focused on their own initiatives.
Absolutely.
Got it.
They're a great supportive service provider, very reputable. They do a lot of work in Long Beach and the surrounding communities. I think more recently they branched into the Antelope Valley, but they're a phenomenal partner as a service provider.
Nice. And at Holos, you all are focused on building a certain type of housing. Tell us a little bit about that at a high level.
So our previous work included a lot of permanent supportive housing. That means housing for the homeless. But in that reflectionary period of time, we came back and we said, are we really helping folks? So while we're able to take someone who was previously living on the streets and give them beautiful housing, give them supportive services, are they able to be economically mobile? Are they able to move on? And what we found out was the answer to that was no. And it was primarily due to economic reasons. So, for instance, most of these individuals will pay their rent through project-based vouchers. That means Section 8 that we secure for the building. And if an individual now decides to get a job, now that additional revenue kicks them out of Section 8, but it's not enough to pay market rate rent. So, therefore, what do? You stay put. And we've ended up with this model that inadvertently has created a welfare state. And I know folks are very uncomfortable with that word, but that is the truth. So what we really need is to create a continuum that provides stepping stones towards economic mobility, and at that same time, create a safety net for people coming down, right? So an individual could have fallen into hard times, lose their job, and in that process, maybe they start using drugs, because they're depressed. And then what do we do with those folks? They end up in the streets because we don't have a place to put them. So we need those models, those stepping stones in buildings, but we don't have the financial tools. The tax credit program, for instance, doesn't have a model like that. So we've created something that's very concentrated, but it's not mixed. And that's the place that we are today, is in the process of creating that economic mobility model.
That's what the future focus of Holos is.
Absolutely.
I'm glad you brought this up because it was going to be one of my questions. But what are the numbers like on this dynamic of, like, let's say for every 100 people that go into a permanent supportive housing unit, how many people are stuck in place? Is it everybody? Or do some people actually get out and move on to a better part of life or more productive, let's say, not necessarily better, but let's call it more productive?
That's a hard question to answer, but I will answer it. If I had to sort of look at the numbers in our buildings, it's probably somewhere between 5 to 10%. But most of those individuals are individuals that have either reunited with family, which is great, or individuals that actually end up moving out of state because that's the only other place where they can afford to pay rent, right? So,
okay, and so in that instance, sorry to interrupt you, but in that instance, the tenant is making the economic calculus, basically saying, like, maybe they've secured a job, but that differential between their income and the rent, it changes if they go to a different market. So they're like, okay, fine, I can make a couple thousand more than my rent in this place versus, okay.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I was having this conversation over Father's Day brunch with my nephew, who was complaining about this to my brother-in-law. And we got to talking about, wages. And if you take a look at wages, where they were, let's say in the 1950s versus housing cost, that delta today is tremendous, right? Mostly everyone is rent burden, right? And if you have a mortgage, mostly everyone is mortgage burden. And so we have this condition that we've created, that because we haven't kept up with production and wages haven't gone up, we have this perfect storm.
Yep. And it's like I've been writing and talking about this a lot for the last several years, but it's sort of the hidden, I guess it's not really hidden, but it's hidden from the national debate. Like, you don't hear the presidential candidates really discussing this. But if you want to look at the rot that's at the core of American society, it's this breakdown between what you can earn and where you can live. And it's really antithetical to the American experiment. Like, this whole thing was about housing.
Well, it's, according to my nephew and many other folks that I've chatted, it's killed the American dream, right? And I think it kind of starts there. But in Los Angeles, it's particularly acute because urban sprawl has made owning a home unsustainable, right? And so what we need to do is figure out how to go up. And you're absolutely right. That's a topic that largely goes undiscussed. So let me go down this rabbit hole here for folks. So 70% of Los Angeles is zoned R1. That means 70% of Los Angeles is zoned for single family residences. So where the heck are we supposed to put? So, we start throwing numbers, right? And you say, okay, 100,000 folks, let's just say countywide, are homeless, just to round up. And then you got another 500,000 units affordable. These are rough numbers. And then you got another number that's missing middle, and then another number that keeps going up. And we end up with something like 1.5, 2 million units that we need to be building in the region. And we got nowhere to put it, right? And smart growth principles tell us the place to put that is next to public transit, high ridership public transit. But because we don't have that, then we're sort of stuck doing it in pieces here, a couple of units here, a couple of units there. But if we actually sat down together as Angelinos and agreed on where that density needed to go, then guess what? We can build that production. It can be cheaper. We can do it probably with less parking because you're tying it next to transit. And we can protect the integrity of single-family neighborhoods. And we haven't done that as a city, right? And the politicians are not really talking about it. But that's, in my opinion, that's where it begins. And I can cite some examples of that for you that I have recently learned.
Yeah, let's get into that. But I want to ask
Yeah.
a follow-up question before we do that. So I've thought a lot about this, and I've actually had several guests come on and discuss ideas on how to go about doing that. They've also complained about the politicians who definitely don't want to get in this town. Definitely do not want to give up their sort of spot zoning power, which is what really makes a city council member. But I came across an article just recently that really kind of opened my mind maybe to a different idea, and I'm super curious to get your response. The article was kind of, it's aligned with our thinking, which is
Okay.
like, we obviously need to build density and it needs to
Right.
be vertical. But they basically like, why don't we stop messing with these corrupt political urban environments and just try to build some new communities somewhere else from the ground up? What do you think about that? Like, which one do you think is more likely to be successful? Like, get the rezoning done in LA, or just say, you know what, let's try to build somewhere else?
Well, here, I'll give you an interesting example of that. Something that actually happened. It didn't happen to us. And I want to say, I'm trying to go back, but I want to say maybe it was 10, 15 years ago. The Tenderloin, I think they're called Tenderloin Community Housing, TNDC. TNDC had a project in downtown San Francisco. And the project's covenants were about to be expired. And they had a choice to do the project again there. They probably couldn't get much more density than what it currently had. They could sell it and just pocket the money, or they could sell it and build 3 times as many units in the peripherals of the city. I would say that, so TNDC ended up doing that, by the way.
They did the not the
Yeah.
suburban, but the periphery. Got
Yeah.
it.
And I would say,
Yeah.
I would caveat that with ensuring that public transit was attached to that. So I was recently part of a delegation that went to Vienna. It was about 60 of us. And they were showing us a project called Seestadt Aspern. And I'm sure that I'm butchering up the name. But it was in the outskirts of Vienna. They called it a project, but it was 10,000 units spread over something like 8 or 9 towers, ginormous towers. But it was a lake in the middle. And the folks that were presenting to us asked a question to the group, and they said, what do you guys think was the first thing that we did in planning this 10,000 unit project? And folks started talking about buying the land, soils tests, all kinds of stuff that are more typical of the urban environment, on how we build here. And they said, the very first thing that we did was we put the metro stop. Poof, right? Second thing, bike lanes. Third thing, we made the streets really small and no parking. And I'll tell you, we toured the various buildings. They had a lake, by the way, in the center, filled with fish. And it also doubled as cooling through passive means into the building. It was absolutely gorgeous. And it was amazing. They were able to reduce their costs. They did it holistically. It was very, very impressive piece of infrastructure because it goes beyond housing. But we don't have that level of organizing here, at least in Los Angeles, to be able to conceive so many things coming together to be able to do that. But to answer your question in this long roundabout way, I think if we were to connect it to transit, to be able to connect it to other means of transportation, like bike lanes, I think it could work, and it works everywhere else in the world.
Yeah. It seems like it could. Like in that same article, the author was talking about how Singapore often gets held up as similar to Vienna, a place
Yes.
that sort of solved its housing problem.
Yes.
And the author pointed out that Singapore didn't go about solving the Los Angeles problem. They just built a bigger city and they built the corresponding infrastructure around it. So like rather than fight with the politicians about whether to upzone Hancock Park, they
Right.
just built some metro stations out in the outskirts and built a bunch of towers, and then that gave them the density and the space they needed to produce it, which I think is super interesting. What else about Vienna is working in their model? Like they also are always put on the top of the list as places that have sort of solved their housing problem. You don't see street level homelessness there. They have high rates of occupancy and not necessarily ownership, but like they just don't seem to have a housing problem. What are they doing right?
Well, the other impressive thing is that on all large lots, by law, 2/3 of it have to be social housing. They call it social housing. Over here, we have a problem with the word social, but it's affordable housing essentially. So even if you wanted to gentrify, even if you were the world's richest investor and wanted to go out there and build penthouses all over Vienna, 2/3 of it would have to be affordable housing. That concept has really translated into the politicians' discourse, which is weird, right? So the politicians, at least us from here in LA, of an individual saying, "I am proud to be the mayor of Vienna," because you can't look at any portion of the city and be able to say that's where poor people live, right? They have truly an income integrated city that they are proud of. And there's also within that a concept that if an individual is not rent burdened, they will have disposable income. And with that disposable income, they can actually invest in the local economy. What a wonderful concept, right? Or they can go on to become educated. I think there's greater history there, and that's something that we can learn from to be able to have a better city, right? A better city and a more equitable city that provides housing for everyone.
Yeah. That's the one criticism I've heard about the idea that you could translate the Vienna model to America is that this is over a really long time period, right? Like this
Yes.
social housing stuff they've been doing.
100 years,
Yeah.
since essentially it all started in World War I. But, the city was decimated after World War II. So there was an organizing movement, if you will, of being able to put people into housing because you just had these horrific conditions.
Yeah. Interesting. You brought up another point about the Vienna model, which is fascinating, which is the fact that it's like integrated from an economic standpoint.
Yes.
And I feel like just like we were talking about with the housing being unaffordable as like the secret problem of America, there's another one too, which is economic segregation.
Yes.
Like we may have constitutionally, through the Supreme Court codified against things like racial segregation, but we definitely have a major economic segregation problem in America. And you see it in the voting trends. You see it in these crazy maps that show up about who gets elected president in all the counties that. And I had a number of people on the podcast talking about the election, and their view was that in rural America, it's actually way worse. Like the people who are living in rural environments are significantly poorer than people who are living in the poorest parts of our town, and they have no resources. So I don't know if there's a question there, but it's just something that like no one's talking about. Even around here, no one's talking about it.
Well, let me give you some insights. I don't have all the solutions. I have a few solutions, but I don't have all the solutions. But we've done some, in underwriting, we call it sensitivities, right? We've done some sensitivities, some focus groups on this subject, where we've taken a bunch of young folk and said, if I could build an apartment that you could own, and that apartment was small, it was efficient, and it was connected to transit, but there was no parking, because parking is something like 20% of cost, not to mention how much it contaminates. Would you purchase it? And you'd be surprised at the answers. I would say about 50% of, let's call them Gen Zers, if you will, but it's a broader group than that. How many folks actually need that vehicle? But that's because the city, right, has been designed in that way. So you can't really mobilize in Los Angeles without public transit. But that is a piece of that puzzle. It's an economic piece. And the smaller the project, the more expensive that parking becomes. And the bigger, the cheaper it becomes. So if we are able to actually go higher, then that cost, becomes smaller. But you now come back to that zoning piece and you say, what can you really go up? And by higher, I mean higher than 6 stories. Right? I'm talking about towers. I'm talking about 12 stories. I'm talking about 20 stories, 30 stories. And people get offended by this in Los Angeles. But if we truly want to create housing for everyone, we're going to need to go up and figure out where that goes. And we're going to have to talk about parking because it's part of that conversation.
Yeah. Unless maybe on the parking front, I've thought about this a lot. Like, I think the only chance we have essentially, because the public transit is just too far behind. It's
Yes.
taking too long to build. But maybe these robo-taxis could save us. Like, I don't know how many would have to be in this town and how cheap they'd have to be, but maybe that could help people. But that was sort of the excitement around Uber when it came out, which is like, oh, well, maybe you could live in a place like LA and not have a car. But I don't know how close we are to that, and I don't know if we should bet on that. We probably should be a little more proactive.
We've created some models around this, and they've been kind of hit and miss. So, for instance, on some of the larger projects that are next to, public transit, we're also reserving a couple of spots for, rideshare vehicles. So you can take your app, and let's say that particular day, you're not just going into your job, you have a job interview and it's something super important that you need to be there on time and you don't want to risk it with public transit. Well, you could have access to that, The beautiful thing is that could also be green and connected to sort of the microgrid that you've created in this new futuristic world, right, where that building would be net zero. I think there is a world where you have options that are not just public transit that exists in LA with the infrastructure. We just haven't played with it enough.
Yeah. And it's hard to imagine like playing with it with enough intelligence and foresight at scale in a town like this because of all the brain damage it takes to build these things.
And here's one more for you. So this weekend we celebrate the grand opening of our Isla project, and the lenders were there, and I was talking about this mixed income approach. And we got into talking about parking, right? And I said, hey, if we do this, true mixed income, meaning like 150% of area median income, folks that are making some good chunk of change but just want to live in the inner pockets, in the inner city, would you provide a loan without parking? And they said no. And I was very surprised at this. And I've had this conversation with other lenders, right? So there's also a growing up that we need to do there. Now, this would be a non-conversation if we were in New York.
Yep.
Right? New York doesn't have a problem with that level of density. They'll put 600-700 units and not a problem. Right?
That's right.
So it's a growing up thing that we have to do, and we have to discuss, and we have to make tough decisions as a city.
Yeah, we need everybody to be on board.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up the parking and lender situation because I feel like there's kind of a storm brewing on what is otherwise a pretty positive story. So just to give the audience that aren't in the weeds like you and I, the mayor of LA passed this thing right when she became mayor called Executive Directive 1, which essentially streamlined affordable housing. Lo and behold, as a result of these streamlined measures, a whole bunch of projects showed up in the pipeline, which nobody thought would happen. And there's something like 16,000 units, maybe more by now,
Right.
in the pipeline, all of which have no parking or substantially close to zero parking. But no one's checked with the lenders and the construction lenders, like
That's correct.
who's going to lend on this. So like,
That's correct.
even though the pipeline looks robust, it looks like a huge public policy win, and I'm glad the mayor did it. The game is not over because you actually have to get financing. The developers have to figure out how to get these things built.
Yeah.
And they're relying on all these bonuses that are in theory cool and provide, density that developers need. But if you can't get a loan because a lender can't see through the parking thing, then what are we talking about?
Yeah, we're living interesting times. I mean, we have so much pro-housing legislation coming out of the state, right? I've never seen so many incredible AB, assembly bills, Senate bills that allow us to do things. So we've kind of created the seat, which is wonderful. But I don't think we have the underwriting piece, the financial piece there yet, right? To be able to fully do that. And I think we can learn from other places, other countries. And I know it's somewhat of an ego hit, right? I can tell you, for instance, I'm from Chile. And in Chile, you can purchase a unit in a building while it's in construction. And as a matter of fact, you get a big fat discount. So a lot of folks do it. We call it buying in green. Because if now I'm able to take your mortgage in my construction, right, that's construction interest that I don't have to pay. I can write that down or do whatever I want with that money, right? And so we don't have these sort of tools available to us. But I think they have to be created, and kudos to the mayor for creating ED1, like you said. But now we need to have that conversation about whether the lenders are going to allow it. But I think the other piece of that conversation also has to be public transit. Are we siding by public transit if we are now building without parking? Because otherwise, are we now just introducing a parking problem to an area, primarily if that area is single-family homes, right? We have to be thinking about those pieces as well. It's a holistic thing.
Totally. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, and it now feels like a good time because of where we've gone with this conversation, is you mentioned a minute ago that we have this strange dynamic where at the state level, there's like an incredible pro-housing momentum. And it's years in the making now.
Yes.
It's maybe almost 10 years. Yet in the big cities, in LA, for example, but all the other big cities around town, the NIMBYs are winning. And they're winning the city council type seats in terms of, and when I say NIMBYs, I say people who are just sort of generally anti-development or find ways to be anti-development. And it seems like what strikes me as odd about this dynamic is that the representatives who go to Sacramento are being voted by the same people who are
Right.
voting in the city council. So it's almost like there's two majorities. And I'm curious about why you think that's happening, or have you ever thought about it? And like, why do we have this two majorities that are so at odds with each other, where we have state representatives who are pro-housing and then everyone local is anti-housing?
I don't have the answer for that question, but I can tell you that I've done a bit of research on the history as to the why, right? And I don't know how many of the audience gets the AAA magazine, right? But AAA has this magazine. I think it's called Westways, and it has spots you can drive to and so forth. But at the end, there's always a picture, a black and white picture, that has an automobile, and that automobile is usually in a freeway, right? So you'll see, for instance, like a car in the 50s going over the Hollywood freeway right before the Highland exit, right? Like I came here today, and there's 3 other cars in the freeway. That romance is something that's very much alive today. And that romance of being in that car is the same romance around the American dream, right? So when we think of the American dream, we think of that white picket fence. We don't conceptualize owning an apartment, at least not here in Los Angeles, going up. So it's funny because you're protecting a dream, but that dream doesn't really exist anymore. It's the same thing as when folks complain about encampments and moving those folks. Those folks don't want those folks in the street. And guess what? I also don't want them in the streets. The only difference is that I care and I want to build housing for them. I just don't have enough resource and I don't have a place to actually put them. So I think that there's that conversation. That's what I'm saying. I've come to the realization that that's the first piece of that conversation, that macro helicopter thing that needs to happen is where are we going to put it, right? If you're saying we are anti-density, then where am I going to put it? Because theoretically, we have something called a housing element, right? That's part of something called a general plan. Every city has it. And it states how many housing units we need, right? And cities are supposed to abide by them, but they can't, right? Because there's so much opposition. And we have that, we see it all over the San Gabriel Valley. You know, we have all these incorporated cities where they just don't want the density. We got to be able to put it somewhere, so we have to agree on that. So I think it's got to start with that conversation first, because the other stuff is already made. The groups are already made.
Yeah, I agree. And I like your point. I agree with you. I think that the American dream was certainly recast to include the automobile. That's still a strong part of it. And the automobile basically is a prominent feature of it.
Absolutely.
Really, if you look across the country. LA is kind of a weird city because it's a suburb essentially that got really built up after the automobile had already become a part of the American dream. Yeah. There's really only on the West Coast, like maybe one city that is remotely non-automobile based, and it was San Francisco. And then everything else out here is car-based.
There's another piece here that we should probably discuss, and that is a phenomenon that's happening over the last 10 to 20 years. But it's a lot older than that, but it's more acute now. And that is migration onto cities. The migration onto cities is occurring because this is where the jobs are. And it's easy to point south of the border to saying that migration is coming from there, but that reality is that migration exists domestically, nationally, right? Folks are fleeing these spaces. And we now have one additional complexity, and that is we have climate migration, right? So for instance, you take a look, there was a study that was made that was fascinating about, I think was it Paradise? The city that burned up north, right?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Okay. So Paradise burned down, but all these surrounding communities also suffered. And the folks that suffered the most were older folks and children who developed asthma-like conditions. Those individuals couldn't live in those areas anymore, so those folks have to migrate, right? And as we have other climate migration issues, whether it's poor quality of air or access to water, or things of this nature, so they're not going to be purely economical, and they're not going to be purely, let's say, refugees of war coming from other countries as those waves might have previously been. We're going to have a greater complexity to deal with, and we can't just sort of turn our heads and say, we don't want it. It's here. All the big cities are experiencing this. So whether we like it or not, we have to be able to discuss the topic of density. And that's a topic that's no one is discussing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like the third, there's like Social Security or something.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, and the climate migration is just beginning. We really haven't even seen it yet.
That's right.
Yeah. So
That's right.
it's
I want to say that climate migration, last time I read this and I was looking into models, is eating away somewhere like 1 to 2 meters of coast. So that would be what? I don't know, 5 feet, 6 feet of coast a year, right? It's just the water's just eating it slowly, 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 slowly. And, in some areas in California, that's going to be huge because, you have erosion that goes with that impacts your water tables, right? It has all kinds of repercussions. So we have lots to think about.
Yeah, I totally agree. I want to ask you, Christian, you're one of the most enthusiastic, compassionate, high energy nonprofit leaders that I've ever come across. And I really appreciate that about you. You always have a great energy and attitude about you. How did this come about for you? How did you end up, doing this work for your life's mission?
Well, thank you, first of all. um, my dad was a champion chess player in Chile. And I remember he taught me how to play chess very young. And he would always, I remember being very small. I mean, I remember being 4 or 5. And he would always, we would play without the queen, right? Which is the most powerful piece on the board. Because he would always say to me, you have to be able to do things without resources. So I almost consider myself like a scavenger, like a bottom feeder, that's just picking up all the remnants and pieces of being able to do something like that. And I almost feel like I can't get too comfortable because if I do, I lose my survival tactics. So I think in coming to this country and learning more about that, I view that as an advantage. I often think about in interviews, what do you ask somebody to know their true constitution? It's almost like asking, did you have toys, hoping they would say they didn't have toys when they grew up, and then you're like, well, what did you play with? But you're secretly wanting them to say, I built my own toys and I created my own games, right? So providing you sort of an insight into somebody's resourcefulness, right? And I'm sure you can ask that a million different ways without hopefully not getting in trouble with HR.
Right.
But be that as it may, I think that for me, I enjoy that. I enjoy being able to derive new models, be able to play with the built environment in a way that it can do more than what it's currently doing everywhere else. So, for instance, going back to this Isla grand opening, and this project was conceived 7 years ago, and it has one of the first shared streets in Los Angeles, and it has a living lung. So these are trees that break down the contaminants because it's right by a freeway, and it's irrigated with a gray water system that's recycled water from the building itself. So it's very holistic. And we're very proud of the building and the showpiece of that because we're able to, if I may geek out for a second, on that reflectionary point that I was telling you about, before when we rebranded to Holos Communities, if you take a look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it starts off with air, and then it goes water, then it goes food, and then goes shelter. And then if you were to look at supportive services, they'd be on that sort of second tier, right? So we've been able to derive strength from that model. And we employed it in our Isla development, Isla intersections, where we said, okay, how can we hit on air? So that's how we derived the living lung. And how can we hit on water, right? Well, we created the gray water system that's in a public right-of-way, by the way. And then we said, how are we able to provide food for everyone? And we didn't activate programming on some of the terraces to create community gardens. And we're now connecting with another group who was totally planning everything. I mean, it's gorgeous up there, right? You got strawberries, you got lettuce, you got cucumbers, you got all this wonderful stuff. So now we got food, and then we got housing, right? And then you got services. So now we sort of created this model. So it's the idea of almost being, I guess, a child and being able to view this for more than what it is, not checking off boxes in some funding application,
Yeah.
right?
Which it can be mind numbing, right? You're doing that
Absolutely.
en masse because you got 20 different places to apply for. So back to your childhood. I never knew that about your father. When you were young like that, did he smash you or did he let you win? Like, what was the dynamic when you're playing
My
chess
dad
with him?
never, ever let me win. Ever. Not once.
Nice. That's probably good life skills for you because you had to hold your own. Was he competing internationally, like that level, or
No, it was just nationally in Chile.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And how good did you get?
I was okay. I've always been okay. I mean, I played chess a lot with my son. We played last night. He's 15.
Do you let him win or do you smash him?
No, I usually don't let him win.
Okay.
But he's getting better. He's getting like really. He's actually won me a couple of times, which
Nice.
is like these crazy moves. And I was like, when he plays these crazy moves, I say, lean into it. Don't once you start it, don't let it go. Keep going, right?
Yeah.
And so it's good thinking, right? Because you have like, it's funny. It's a little bit like developing these projects. So you're playing like 10 or 15 different games in your mind. And each game has like 10 or 12 moves ahead, right? So
Yeah.
you're like, it's almost like, a computer that's saying, okay, this set of, these set of responses renders this conclusion, and then this set of, action renders this. So then you have to optimize which one is the best. But each time you make a move, it changes all of those dynamics, right? So you're consistently keeping your mind active, which I suppose is a good thing.
Definitely a good thing. Okay, so you had this experience when you were younger about resourcefulness and lesson learned from your father, but what took you to, like, did you always want to be a developer? How did you end up on this path of being someone who cares about building, affordable housing or housing for the homeless and helping people who are sort of economically disadvantaged get on their feet?
I always thought that I was going to be an architect. I've gravitated to that for a very long time. I think I was just born with that piece. But the architect, the designer of a building, oftentimes doesn't get to connect to other things. And that's what a developer gets to do, right? We get to connect to things like transit, for instance. So be part of the Broadway Manchester corridor, right? We get to be able to activate sometimes multiple sites that you are able to piece together or have an impact on an entire neighborhood because you've done multiple projects there that now renders you the ability to, I don't know, activate commercial spaces that previously weren't there. So that holistic piece, I think, for me, drove me towards development that then led to sort of this place of sustainability and equity and being able to bring in all my capacities, all my faculties together.
Yeah. And did you ever work for a for-profit developer?
Never.
Like, what was your arc, your career arc?
I never worked for a for-profit developer. I was always kind of in the nonprofits, and then I worked for a syndicator called Edison Capital. This is in the early 90s. And then I worked for the National Equity Fund for about 5 years. So I did tax credit syndication. And I enjoyed that. But it was purely underwriting, purely yield driven. And I felt extremely disconnected from communities and the pieces of work that I feel more passionate about. Right. So while this type of work is significantly more complicated and probably more stressful, it feels, at least to me and my personality, it fits better.
Yeah. Well, the tax credit work was good though, because it gave you the other side.
That's right.
Now you know what they're looking at, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Interesting. Did either of your parents engage in like service type work?
My mom was a midwife.
Okay.
My mom was a midwife, and being very young, I got to see a lot of children being born.
Yeah.
And my mom was extremely, to this day, my father passed away many moons ago, but my mom is an extremely technical woman. And that work, I think, fueled that other side, right? That's sort of like less about efficiency and more about caring.
Yeah. What did your father do? Did he earn income from chess, or did he have to work as well?
My dad here was a blue collar worker, and he drove an MTA bus.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So literally like a chess genius
Yeah.
driving a bus. That's
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Well, thanks for sharing that. I always like to try to understand like what makes a person tick, and it always reveals like the most interesting stories that I never knew your
Yeah.
case about that even though we've been friends for all these years. Very cool. So I want to go back to kind of where we were at the beginning of the conversation around Holos and your team and you getting together and looking at the data and saying, wow, man, even though we're doing good work, we're providing this housing for people who otherwise wouldn't have it. There's more to it. And tell me more about that, and tell me about the vision. Like what are you trying to do? And what, bigger question maybe you can answer after is, how do we actually solve this crisis of homelessness in Los Angeles?
Yeah. That's a big question. Let me give you an assessment of today's environment. So today's environment, at least for nonprofit developers, is like I was saying, we're living a time of the most pro-housing legislation we've ever had, which is wonderful. But ironically enough, also the least amount of public dollars. Now, when you have no public dollars and you have this convergence of high construction costs, it makes for a recipe for no production, essentially, right? So we're about to engage in that right now as an industry. So now let's go back and look at that mixed income housing model as an opportunity. So you say, okay, can I, for instance, cross-subsidize rents? Let's truly make believe that maybe a project has, I don't know, 20, 25% affordable, and then it has these stepping stones, right? And I want to cross-subsidize those rents with higher AMIs. Well, because construction's so high, that means I have to take out a really big loan, right? And the only way to do that is to be able to have high rents. There's only a handful of places in the city that has those high rents, and even fewer places connected to transportation. So we're trying to sort of figure out where those squares are in the city to be able to create these models that contain an affordable component, but it's done without any public dollars or without any Section 8. For us, we take that to heart. As a matter of fact, we even put it in our organizational priority for this year, is to be able to develop that. So let me take this a little step further to answer your question. We have a Project Home Key site in K-Town, right off the Vermont exit. For those folks that don't know what a Project Home Key site is, a project that basically we got some one-time pandemic money, and it's 100% permanent supportive housing. But it's right next to the MTA station. This is Vermont and Beverly. And there happens to be a burned down building right next to it. As a matter of fact, there's a little karaoke bar called Goody Goody. This still has the sign. So we call it the Goody Goody building. And right next to that is the actual, Vermont Beverly metro station. So we are saying, well, what if this project had a really small affordability component, and it was mostly market, and we're able to get a piece of the MTA site, because MTA is much more likely to give you access to their land if you already own right next to them. So, we ran some massing exercises and we can fit about 160 units there. And that's exactly where we need to be building that density. So we've internally created a name for it. We call it a micronode, right? And that micronode would essentially have these stepping stones, because what a better place, right? You have sort of permanent supportive housing in this one building, and then the next building next to it, this goody site, has this affordable component, and then it goes up to market, and then you're building right on top of the MTA station. So those are the opportunities that we're looking at, is in trying to create that density that's connected, and that had access to those higher revenue generating rents, to be able to make some actual dents in the numbers.
Yeah, for sure. And in that micronode, I think that's a really cool concept. How do you help the individuals, or what's your thinking on how to help the individuals who, let's say they start off, they're formerly homeless, they start off in the permanent supportive housing building. How do you get them along? Like what do you have to do that?
Great question. So we work with some incredible partners. So in this case, we work, for instance, with John Masseri over at the People Concern. John is able to take somebody, let's say an individual that's 15% of area median income, and they just get general relief. That's $221 a month. A month. That's it. That's all they get to survive. Well, we currently work with our service provider to be able to get folks into Social Security, right? That bump takes you north of $1,000 a month, but that's huge, right? Because that also gets you medical benefits, and you're able to treat, let's say, a long-term chronic health issue that you may have had, because your body's an ecosystem like anything else. So you're treating your mind as well as your body. In doing that, we're able now to help folks, once they've gone into that step, into potentially getting a job, right? But instead of going to market, we have that affordable unit to have them step into right next door, right? And that's something that we can't do in any other building. But it's a process. It's a journey.
Totally. And when someone goes from the general to the Social Security, and then let's say they get a job, do they lose the Social Security part of it when they get the job, or do they keep it?
No, they lose their Section 8, essentially.
They lose their voucher. I
Yeah,
see.
the
Social Security is tied to them.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then the voucher is typically tied to the development.
Yeah.
Unless you have a housing choice voucher or a tenant-based voucher. But typically our buildings, we go after that project-based voucher, and it stays with the building.
Okay. That's super interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so zooming out now.
Yeah.
How do we have in LA City, whatever, 40,000, let's call it, LA County, 70,000.
Right.
How do we actually solve this? What's your view?
Well, I think if we take the lessons learned from the past, it has to come back to where we site, number one. But number two, instead of trying to come up with more money, let's see what we got in our fridge, right? So if you invite me over, for steak and mashed potatoes and spinach with lots of garlic and good stuff, right? But when I get to your house and I pop open your fridge and I say, "Hey, Nick, all you got is this old piece of cheese and this stale piece of bread," right? Then what you've offered me can't really be achieved, right? So we got to start off with, what do we got? What do we have? And when the old, now defunct CRA went away, the city inherited a lot of housing assets. But we've never quite done an inventory of those housing assets. And I'm certain that a percentage of those could hold significant density, and a percentage of those would be sited next to high transit transportation corridors. So why don't we start there, right? Because that's sort of what gets the ball rolling. That inventory, I don't think, has occurred because the city needs more capacity. The city hasn't been conceived that way to be, let's say, a land development unit that could potentially entitle something, let's say through some sort of Senate bill, or maybe it's just as simple as TOC. That's still a process. It's not something you immediately get, right? And in that same process, what if that same unit could also engage in community engagement meetings and bring the community along, right? And be able to say, look, we're going to build high. Maybe it's a mass timber tower, right? So it's not contaminating, and because it's mass timber, the numbers work, right? And it's like no parking because you're tied next to transit. I think we would need to do a few of those pilots in those areas that we believe we could go up to be able to demonstrate how we can do this. And I think what would be wonderful if it was also mixed income, so we get everybody's buy-in, right? It would have to start from a seed like that. And I think that's why the Vienna model is so successful, is because you already start off with the presumption that whoever it is you are, that you're going to be buying that piece of land, immediately 2/3 have to be affordable housing, right? So if there's a lesson to be learned there, that's that piece. That would be the seed that I would say. We can get into, other pieces of solving I think for the purpose of this conversation, it's better calling it the housing crisis, right? To be able to solve that.
Yeah. So are you of the mind that we could, with a combination of some of these ideas, we could actually build enough housing to prevent homelessness in the city?
I think homelessness is we could absolutely solve it, right? I think it would have to be a combination of, like I said, let's do that inventory of what we got, right? Okay, so if you do an inventory of what you got and what you could go up to, that's going to give you a number, right? A number of housing units, but we already know what those numbers are. So, okay, what cannot now be built in the inner city? Okay, well, now we start going to the peripherals, right? And then fill in everything else in between. But those numbers, like I said, are so staggering. We've never actually thought about, well, where are we actually going to put it?
Yeah. What do you say to the people who say, no, like housing isn't it? There's too many people who are addicted to drugs and they're refusing to go into shelter. What do you say to that whole conversation?
Well, there's certainly a percentage of folks that are currently homeless that have mental illness that do drugs. But that number, believe it or not, is actually decreasing because the folks that are falling into homelessness now are not single males. You don't have that image anymore. If you start looking at it, they're ugly numbers. They're families. They're female head of households with 2 children. And those numbers are staggering, right? We absolutely need to continue creating shelters. We need to continue creating transitional living facilities, continue funding supportive services. We need that. But there's also here's another one for you. Mental illness is circumstantial. It could happen to anyone. It could happen to me. It could happen to you, right?
Yeah.
And it could also be potentially triggered by some traumatic event, right? If I lose my job, if I have a falling out with my family, and then now I end up doing drugs as a result of it, it's horrific, but it's circumstantial. So we have to think about it, I think, in the form that these events are going to happen. And sometimes those people are us. Those events happen to us. I had a close friend of mine who one time, I go to his house all the time, and over a bottle of wine, his sister-in-law came over. This is many moons ago. And we got to talking about development, very much this similar conversation. And I got to talking, they're Japanese. And I said, hey, we need to go up like Tokyo. And they're like, oh my God, no. Well, you now fast forward to days like today, and their son got into drugs. And they're a very different set of individuals today than they were then, and much more sympathetic to this. to, creating the housing that goes up to be able to now provide the services to individuals to be able to give. It's complex, right? It's complex. There's a lot of different pieces that we've talked about today.
Definitely. Yeah, I wanted to ask you that because here's my my concern
Yeah.
about this town. Mayor Bass is coming in and has been very aggressive on homelessness, more aggressive than anyone who's on the right in this town. The right in LA is not really right, but anyone who was on the right who was supporting Caruso, for example, didn't expect her to be as aggressive on homelessness as she has been
Right.
with her Inside Safe program and ED1 and all the things she's trying to push through on the development side. But I fear that the sort of time horizon that she has or that this movement has, which I would characterize as sort of a compassionate approach to dealing with this problem, is really short.
Yeah.
And we get to this next election, and I feel like here's what's going to be on the table: Bass or a candidate who's like, you know what, no one's sleeping on the street. We're building shelters that we're going to force people to go into, and no matter what, and that'll mark the end of the housing first movement in a
Right.
sense, because we're
Right.
going to end up like New York. Because
Right.
once you start doing that, I think Angelinos understand it. Everyone says, well, what about New York? Well, the New York program costs $4 billion a year.
Yeah.
If you want to invest in the resources that are going to constantly take people off the street and put them in a shelter, it's going to cost a lot of money.
Right.
And Los Angeles has kind of not done that because we've been pursuing housing first, but I feel like the time horizon for that is coming to an end. What do you think?
Oof, that's a loaded question, Nick. Yep, a little bit more so I can gather my thoughts here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I don't know. Like, I have a very limited sample size of people. I basically talk to like other parents, right? So that because my kids are young and my whole social life is essentially like going to their birthday parties. But in the conversations I'm having, I get this feeling that there's exhaustion.
There's
There's
exhaustion.
voter exhaustion
There is.
about why do we keep seeing encampments? Why are there, people who are threatening, who appear to be threatening to our children at the parks? Why are the parks dirty? Why are the park bathrooms like unsafe? There's all these things that I hear in my sort of echo chamber. And I feel like it could be spreading around the city and overcoming what has been a very strong bias towards housing first and towards the compassionate response.
I go back and it has to start with production. We need to be able to produce enough housing for everyone. Let me give you a totally separate example. We have a building in Barstow. For folks that don't know, Barstow's in the middle of the way between now and Vegas. That is an affordable development. That affordable development has a huge vacancy rate. And the reason why it has a huge vacancy rate is because the affordable rents compete with the market rents. Why? Because there's enough housing for everyone there.
Yeah.
You don't need rent control, right? So I go back, we need to be able to figure out where it's going to go, and then we need to produce it, right? But you're correct that time is horrible, right? We have voter denial at this point in time because it looks like we haven't done enough, right? But I will say this to folks. It's going to get worse, right? If you don't deal with it. And dealing with it has to start where it goes and then figuring out where those resources are going to have to come from. And we have to be able to utilize our resourcefulness because now the problem is not just a housing problem. We have a global warming problem as well. And we're not going to solve it with a 4/1 or a 5/1 over concrete podium, right? It's simply an economic issue and a production issue, and we have to think about it holistically. But you're right. But just putting in another individual that doesn't care is not going to solve it.
Yeah. I know it's a weird time politically because it's unclear actually where the majority is on this issue.
Yeah.
You feel like, and it's another one of these issues too, kind of like the 2016 election where people might not tell you how they're going to vote on that. So like the polling might be inaccurate
Right.
because it's like something that they don't want to admit. Like depending how the question is presented, like, hey, do you want to just take everyone off the streets, using police and put them in shelters?
Yeah.
People might not say yes to that, but they might vote for it because they're upset about it.
If I had a penny for every time I've been at a community meeting where somebody says, hey, there's this warehouse in the corner. If you can just rehab that warehouse and put people into housing, it'd be great, right? It's already there. And we look into the side and it's zone M1. M1 means it's industrial, right? Can't put housing into it. And maybe some ginormous structure. So we got to figure that stuff out. We got to figure it out. The other thing is that the way we've created zoning in Los Angeles is not really conducive to it being a city. So we've separated commercial uses from residential uses in these vast, huge distances. And we're going to have to come back to sort of 15-minute cities, where you can walk and things are more mixed use. And when you're able to do that, you're able to do models like in Barcelona, for instance, they have something called the 10th Street block model, where they took 10 blocks and they closed off all the streets. No more cars. And, kids can play, folks can walk, you can garden, you can do all these really cool things. And at first, this little experiment, they thought that, they were going to miss their cars. And guess what? They're not missing their cars. So we're going to have to create, 10, 15 different new models and test them out and see what folks like. But we're going to have to allow ourselves that space to be able to do new things, because doing nothing is not the solution.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, like the production, your point about Barstow, I think is a great point, because we know that there's criticism of the market approach, because basically people think like real estate always goes up because they're biased. They don't study financial history, but in these environments, like Austin is a good example. I actually presented to La Casa.
Oh, okay.
Which I don't even remember what that means, but essentially it's a group of elected officials who are heading this county joint powers group that they're attempting to get a ballot measure passed to fund a bunch of affordable housing and tenant protections and stuff like that. So I presented to them some ideas, and one of the things I share with them is what's happening in Austin. And Austin's having outright double-digit declines in rents right now, because guess what? They built a lot. But I showed the chart side by side. Austin, as a percentage of inventory, was building 10% a year. So for every million units, they were building 100,000.
Wow.
Where LA was like 1%. Best year of production is 1%.
And most of those were ADUs, right?
Yeah. So to do it, you'd have to ramp it up. And there's a lot of problems with that, but it doesn't mean we should. I like your attitude. Like, we just got to figure it out.
Right.
This is a huge city, and it's actually not even close to fully built out.
No.
If you start consider height, and there's all these like structures that have uses that are no longer relevant. Like these Class B and C offices and these warehouses and all the facilities around town that are just like vacant. So I'm still optimistic.
I'm very optimistic as well. I mean, we're developing these new models, and I want to go back to something.
Yeah.
Luskin did a study, and it talked about how when folks came back from the war, well, let me go back a little bit more. During the war, World War II, in Los Angeles, rents spiraled because production came to a halt. All materials were being utilized to essentially create weapons, right? To fight, we all know the story. Anyways, that's when rent control was first created. What folks don't know, I didn't know this, or maybe some folks know, is that when the troops came back, we were able to build enough to put rent control on pause till the late 70s. The only issue was that we didn't do it correctly. We built enough, but we did it by urban sprawling.
Yep.
Right? So if we would have had, let's say, the old streetcars, and those stations would have gone up, and then we could have still had sprawling, but we would have had, let's say, many downtowns that went up in those respective stops. We would have mechanisms in place where people's mindsets would be different than what they are viewed upon today, right? But there's an example of where we built enough where you didn't need rent control anymore, and you softened the market, right? Exactly what you were saying about Austin, right? You softened the market by production. And now, we forget there was also a time when, landlords had to give away stuff. 1 month free rent. You get a toaster, settle steak knives, right? We don't have that problem today, right? But that would be a wonderful problem, a first world problem to have.
Totally. Yeah. It could come back. Yes. Yeah. Well, this has been a super fun conversation. We're coming to the end of the time. I want to ask you one more question, which is, what is your sort of your vision of what a good citizen is?
A good citizen has to become educated. You don't have to know everything. You would have to vote. You'd have to be educated in the things that you care about, right? So if you're going to say, for instance, I don't want encampments next to my house. Well, then educate yourself on where those people could live, for instance, right? And then be able to vote accordingly to that. And be able to, participate in that process through that education.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up because to me, as someone who's very civically engaged like you, I've done a lot of research and brought myself up to speed about the complexities of these issues. And the number of people in this town who've done that is like pretty limited.
Yeah.
High-powered people that, have big jobs and big companies. Like very few people actually understand why that person is on the street still. Like they don't even understand all the reasons why the system may not be working. And it takes a significant investment in time. And I think that's something that's sort of been lost. You can't just vote. You can't just donate to your presidential candidate and think that that's going to solve some of these issues. They're just too complex.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think, debate with your family, right? Engage in conversations. And those are healthy things.
Yeah. These problems aren't going to solve themselves. So.
No, they're not going to solve themselves.
That's right.
But they are solvable.
They are, exactly. I think that's a perfect place to end it. Cristian, thank you so much for being here, man.
Thank you, Nick.